This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the first episode of QuaranTV. I'm your host, Chris Dobson. It's a bizarre time. First and foremost, I want to say I hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's being safe. QuaranTV is just going to be a little something we're going to have a lot of fun with here online and on Rogers TV to kind of fill the void, if you would. Very excited, my first episode. These two guys are no strangers to the QMJHL and what we're talking about, and I'm sure they both miss sports as much as we do and as much as you guys do. First and foremost, the voice of the St. John Sea Dogs, Mike Sanderson. Mike, thanks for taking time out to do this, brother. I truly appreciate it.
Hey, man, thank you so much. Any chance we get to talk sports is always a good time, but I know I've got like a bookcase behind me, but Chris, you look really cold.
Yeah, not bad. Hey, working some magic on a green screen here right now and having a lot of fun with it. And you heard that last chuckle as well, of course, a guy I've had the pleasure to work alongside here on the Moncton Wildcats on Rogers TV games, Jerry Green, the voice of the Moncton Wildcats. Jerry, how you been keeping yourself busy?
How have I been keeping myself busy? That is the $64,000 question. What have you been doing? Anything to do, but sports has been, there's been a big void in my life, not only watching, talking, or even participating in sports. So I'm glad for the invitation, Chris.
Well, guys, we're going to get right into it because I've got a couple questions, and they're all QMJHL related here. First and foremost, I want to get your thoughts on the season that was. It's been a very unprecedented time. Obviously with the COVID-19, the pandemic, the Canadian Hockey League decided to shut down the season, which was the right move on their part, safety first, of course. But at the end of the day, how do teams recover from this? Who got the worst end of the deal here? Mike, I'll start with you.
I think certainly you look at, I think you can count 5 contenders in the queue that you can point your finger to and say, well, certainly they loaded up at some point in the Christmas period and they made moves to make themselves better this year, and they won't see those moves come to fruition, specifically Sherbrooke, and then the 4 in the Eastern Conference, Moncton, Chicoutimi, Rimouski, and to a lesser extent Cape Breton, though they definitely made some good moves to shore up their depth. Those teams certainly have put years of work into trying to make their teams better, into progressing in their cycle to see that come to its pinnacle. And unfortunately, we won't see the end result of any of that, but definitely 5 teams that were contenders and some surprises beyond that who didn't see a conclusion to their season. I look specifically about players. We won't get to see Alexis Lafreniere make a huge playoff run, as certainly we would have hoped for as maybe a last hurrah in the QMJHL, and Sam Poulin as well, who had a great playoff last year. We don't get to see him make an encore in his position either. This year, the thing that the fans will miss out most on is you look at the top scorers, and the only player in the top 9 who's probably going to come back is Evie Simoneau at Drummondville, and only 4 of the top 16. So there were a lot of good graduate players in the queue this year that fans won't be able to say their goodbyes to.
Yeah, there's been, I know the NHL is delaying whether or not they're going to continue or not, but that's a big money machine. I don't know if there's a whole lot of teams in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League that make a lot of money. There's a huge expense in regards to running a team and so forth. So, off the ice financially, does this really hurt them? Well, they always say that playoff money is money you don't budget for. So if you have a long playoff run, which means home dates, that is all bread and butter money that you make. And if you had great attendance, like let's say the Moncton Wildcats did all season long, 3rd in attendance again this year in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, I'm sure but they do put out a lot of money. Whether or not they made a lot of money is the other question. And the heartbreaking thing about it, when it comes to a guy who loves sports, which is myself, is the heartbreak of what could have been for any of these teams, be it, let's say, Sherbrooke and Moncton, for example. Sherbrooke had a tremendous season all year long, lost 1 game, I think, on home ice, and was number 1 in the CHL all season long. And the Moncton Wildcats, who had built to a pinnacle and a crescendo, if you will, down the stretch, going into the playoffs, looking to break team records, and had a tremendous amount of chemistry going. It's just heartbreaking for the graduating players, the fans, and us fellas who cover them, not to see what could have happened.
To pick up on Jerry's first point, I tweeted out just after the Q season was over that, it'll be curious to see if all 18 teams do make it out of the other side of this situation. As Jerry, you mentioned, the finances are just they're sometimes very difficult to maneuver for a lot of the smaller market teams. I think Moncton will probably be all right. Quebec will be all right. Halifax will probably be fine. You look at teams beyond that, though, you've got some smaller markets in the queue that really do struggle year upon year to fill the seats and to make sure that the money is in the black every year. And, for those teams, it's going to be particularly tough not to have not only hockey, but not really much in terms of making any revenue whatsoever. This was the time where playoff packages were being sold and season ticket renewals were being put together, and really teams use that to budget what their next year is going to look like. And in the absence of a lot of these season ticket renewals, it may be the worst time for these teams. No one knows what their budget for next season could be, or if they have a chance to move forward with that. So it'll be interesting.
Or when that season might be.
Exactly.
Or when that season might start.
To see, what will happen from a business standpoint for the league. I think, Jerry, you talk about teams with the most to lose. I think Moncton is in that position with the most to lose. They made the most moves to make themselves better this year. I think you mentioned Sherbrooke. Sam Levi is likely back if he wants to be next year. Sam Poulin, there's a chance he might come back. I know Sherbrooke kind of held back on a couple of moves because they could also contend whenever next season is with much of the team that they have this season. But the Wildcats really had to go all in this year because much of their core was at this point in time for this season. So I think the Wildcats stood more than any other team with the most to lose this year.
Well, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm sorry, Jerry, I don't want to cut you off, but I mean, we're going to get into a little further in that conversation, Mike, a little down the road, because that's one of my questions here coming up. But I want to stick on the Moncton conversation just a second, because I want to get both your thoughts and opinions on, you alluded to the trades and what took place, Mike. How does Moncton recover from something like this? Again, right decision made by the Canadian Hockey League to make sure this thing was shut down. I mean, they had no choice. They had to follow suit. But if you look at those teams, I mean, how does Moncton come back and recover? I mean, potentially, there's a lot of moves in the hopper here to finalize the big deals that came on through. I would love to know, how does Moncton get through? Jerry, I'll start with you.
Moncton made, I would say they, along with Chicoutimi, made the most high-profile moves.
Right, but Chicoutimi has the chance. Right, but Chicoutimi's going to have the ability to recoup some of those assets next season.
The thing that sticks with me, and it was the first thing I thought of once the season had ended, was that Moncton went all in and acquired the players they needed to build a championship team, which it looked like they were headed in that certain direction. Everything looked positive. But once you snuff out the season, here you had Benoit Olivier Gru for 30 games. You had Fortier for 30 games. You had McIsaac for maybe 20 games, and so on and so forth. And my thought was, how, in an unprecedented move by the CHL to cancel the season, to cancel the Memorial Cup, to cancel the playoffs, do these teams really, do they have to bear the brunt of an unforeseen enemy that comes along and makes the league do what it had to do? Do you, as a league, let's say the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, for instance, and any of the leagues, I'm sure they're all going to talk about it, do you have the opportunity to have all the owners sit down and say, look, this is uncharted territory, and these teams spent a lot, and we know how difficult it is to run a junior team, so on and so forth. Have some compassion for each team. How would you feel if it had to happen to you? Which means don't ever get to finish the regular season, don't even get to contend for the President's Cup, let alone the Memorial Cup. Is there I'll use the word rebate in regards to the trades? I'm not looking to null and void any of these trades, but if you were in the same situation as an owner, as an organization, and you went to all that work and by no fault of your own, yes, if a team stumbled down the stretch and didn't do well in the playoffs, so be it. But when you have not the opportunity to even compete, I think there's got to be some consideration by the other teams.
I wonder what consideration necessarily means in that scenario. I don't know necessarily if it's fair for, say, a Halifax who made a number of moves to say, okay, well, your players are now only worth 70, 80 cents on the dollar, unfortunately, because of this situation. I get that it's unprecedented, and I understand that hopefully this will never happen again. And, how do you prepare for something like that? And in some ways, it's fortunate for the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League that really only Halifax was the team that sold off a lot of their assets at the Christmas trading period. But, the counterbalance to that is there's not much you can really do about it, I suppose. And for the teams that did load up, you did see 20 or 30 games with those players in the lineup. It is a lot of what could have been, but unfortunately, what do you do? I think if there's any kind of rebate, it's got to come at the league level. I hope that it's not as ugly as 2016-17, but what's in the cupboards for next season for the Wildcats, I think they could be a good grinded out team next year. I think scoring's going to be really hard to come by for the Wildcats, but we'll see what the trades shake down and what they can recoup in terms of assets over the next calendar year.
We're not looking to penalize the teams or even penalize any of the teams. And I think the league's already been talking or has had the question fired across their bow in regards to what do we do about all the transactions that were made in these teams that don't get to compete. I think there still has to be a discussion. I don't know how it gets fixed, but there has to be a discussion, and there has to be some sort of consideration by all teams. If you were in that situation, would you like to happen to you, where you've invested all that time and effort and not getting anything for it on no fault of your own?
Well, could we look at a possible scenario where we say, let's take a look at the futures that we're supposed to be going back in regards to the draft picks and how that works out? I mean, picks are gone, and you alluded to Moncton doesn't have a draft pick in the first couple of rounds for the next few years. That's the whole part of the junior hockey cycle. I mean, do they have to just bite the bullet at that point, look at some of the costs and some of the players possibly going the other way? But like you said, Mike, and I kind of see it on both sides of the fence. I mean, if I'm the Moncton Wildcats or, Chicoutimi or Cape Breton, because Cape Breton spent some good money to get a guy like Sean Elliman as well in the lineup. Yeah. I mean, Rimouski paid as well. I mean, it's a bizarre time. So you're right. I would have to think the league's going to look at something. I know that the question's been asked. I saw a good article with our friend Neil Hodge. The question has been asked to the commissioner, Gilles Courteau. Gilles said we've got a lot of other things on our plate right now. Sure. Obviously, it's not top of mind, but it's not the first phone call they've received. So clearly, some of the GMs and the owners are curious as to how you're going to handle it. But is it something potentially that we could see that maybe it's the futures that we're going the other way? And, let's deal with the picks. Like you said, Jerry, it's unprecedented times. This has never happened before. If this was to happen to a team like, say, Halifax, I mean, they could very easily speed up their rebuild pretty quick because they acquired a lot of assets during this trade period in regards to actual draft picks. So Halifax won't be out. Cam Russell's a brilliant man when it comes to doing what he's done. He's built championship teams. Don't kid yourself. He's going to probably pull one of the greatest Euros of all time out of that the import draft. He always seems to grab the big names. I mean, Halifax year after year has been a great hockey team. And again, they've got all the picks and assets. So I'll be really curious. But, like I said, to me, I wonder if maybe it's the futures involved and how that plays out. So who knows?
Well, going further to that, too, I think Halifax wasn't very happy with the handling of the Ostap-Safin situation either. So don't think they're very happy with the league trying to step in and rejigger some compensation one way or the Absolutely. Other way. I think they're not very happy in that scenario regardless. So I think since it's out in the media, and again, kudos to Neil Hodge to cover it, I think that means it certainly is being discussed regardless of what the opinion is, and certainly the league will have to make some kind of decision going forward on it, whatever that happens to be.
Well, what really comes to mind for me, gentlemen, is, and we don't know, let's use the Halifax situation, which Moncton was a great trading partner with them during this trade period, or during that trade period. We don't know, and it's an occurrence that happens at every draft where players go to get those picks back. Right. The first thing I think of is whether or not the Moncton Wildcats have used LaRue as one of those chips, whether or not one of those picks is going to come back and he's going to go to another team. That's the one that really would, I think, affect the Moncton Wildcats' future and or the fans for what a tremendous asset he is. And that if he was sent off in a trade that required, that was used to get picks back, for somebody or something that was there's a player that was used for 25 or 30 games, I just think is not fair. I just don't think it's and I'm just using him and his example. Whether or not the Pelches and the Spences and those types of players are part of these trades as well, we don't know. We're not privy to. Those are the ones I'm thinking of. The ones that where the picks come back at the draft for a particular player, and the one that jumps out to me is Leroux. I just think it would be tremendously unfair if a team like Moncton loses him in one of those deals. And if they have, I do not agree if the Moncton Wildcats did use him as one of those transactions. I just don't see how you can trade away a player like that. And again, I see them wanting to win a Memorial Cup very badly, right. But he is going to be a tremendous star in this league.
Well, I'm going to go right now, guys. Sorry, Mike, I don't want to cut you off because we've only got a couple questions and we've got about 12 minutes left to cover them all. So, you mentioned the draft, and one of the things that took place from a draft standpoint, the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League decided to follow suit across the Canadian Hockey League and said, hey, you know what, guys, we're going to move to an online draft this year strictly because of what is happening. I know it's a mixed emotions. A lot of people thought that maybe you just push the draft till later on in the year. But they decided to go online. That way the draft could still take place. I would love to know both your thoughts on this. Mike, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's fair to have the draft at kind of the same scenario and position in the calendar this season to kind of continue and contribute to the normalcy that we're all looking for in this situation. But I think if the Q had it their way, I think this would be the only year it would be online. I know they love to have the entry draft event on their calendar. I would argue it's probably the second most important event on their calendar beyond the President's Cup final. And I know you talked to Gilles Courteau and the Brain Trust at the Q level. They love the fact that the event of the entry draft is the event. They look at the other two leagues and the drafts that are held online. There isn't much of a ceremony, and they find that holding their rounds of draft in an arena with a bunch of fans present, with every team present, of course, they consider that to be the excellent first impression that really sets them apart from many other leagues around the world, let alone junior leagues. And they consider that to be kind of their crown jewel event to introduce players to the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. They love it. It's also a time where they can all gather together, make use of that time, and have in-person meetings all week long. I know it's a week-long celebration, really, for that whole week leading up to the draft. So the league really loves it as kind of a bookend to the end of their season. And further to that, they love that they can introduce their prospects as they would consider properly with their entry draft event. So I would be surprised if the entry draft continued in its online format past this year. But in this scenario, as we've talked about this whole episode, it's unprecedented times, and you got to do what you got to do. And for the Q, I think going online is the right move this year.
The interesting thing about the draft this year, and I don't know, Mike, did you say that it's going to be held at the time that it's supposed to be held, which was the scheduled time it's supposed to be held, or is there no time set yet when the draft is going to be?
Because it's supposed to be around the same time. Okay. I was kind of playing loose with the calendar there. So
what you have is, unfortunately, for the scouts is not an opportunity to see players down the stretch and into the playoffs. Those players that you're thinking of drafting, because some players can stand out when the heat comes up or get turned up. Some players jump out of the fray and become prominent in your draft. But as we've seen before in the past, with things that or events that change our lifestyle or our way of life being, and we're using this as the Quebec draft being online, sometimes it doesn't get changed back. And I know what you're saying, Mike, and it has, and it is a successful event for them, and it makes the league different than the other leagues. But once you start doing this, sometimes it's like, hey, that didn't go too bad, and we cut costs there, and some other subjects can come up. So the whole, and we've seen it in human nature. Once something's been changed, once you go from a GST to an HST, it doesn't go back to a GST. It stays as an HST.
What a great reference. What a great reference.
But it can be to a point where this is going to be a way of life. So it'll be interesting to see if the draft's going to be held on time, how effective it can be with the shortening of the season and so forth for those scouts that are out watching AAA and other events. And whether or not in the years to come, it'll stay as an online event.
Geez, Jerry, just leave the draft to 15-year-olds to talk about capitalism. A nice jump in there. I'm not sure. I assume it's a lost leader in terms of the draft event. The teams do host it and they compete to host it every year. But Jerry, maybe you're right. Maybe this is one thing that ends up moving online is either a cost-cutting move or they find it's more efficient or whatever they want to do. Yeah. I do know that the Q is a big fan of the event itself, but so I think it would take a lot to change that. But this is a scenario where that could be a lot.
Well, guys, I got one more question that I want to kind of push into now because we're down to about 7 minutes before I have to say goodbye to you smiling guys. I've been looking at, I miss you guys. I'm not going to lie. I want to talk about St. John, Mike, because we're talking about everything that took place this year. We've talked about the past. We've talked about the draft. Let's talk about the future. I mean, there's another Memorial Cup bid coming out here in the QMJHL in just a couple years. A lot of rumors and speculation that Trevor Georgie is going to put his name in a hat to try to put that St. John Sea Dogs team on the map there. They're building some pretty big things right now. I'd love to know what your thoughts are. I mean, he's made it pretty clear that, to tie this all back together to the draft, he's got some first-round picks coming up in these few drafts, too, to help escalate this process. What do you see in the future of St. John?
Yeah, he sure does. He has 6 first-round picks in the next 3 drafts. They have 1 in the lottery this year. Whenever the lottery happens to be, you'll notice the Q said there wouldn't be a lottery and then quickly erased that text really quick once they remembered Gatineau has the first 3 picks in terms of percentage. They have an 81% chance to have the first overall pick in this draft, which I think is an interesting statistic. In terms of St. John, in the Maritime Division, there's a significant power vacuum going forward the next 2 seasons, and I think that St. John's capable to jump right in and kind of take advantage of that. Moncton is certainly a team that will be much lesser than they were this season, a great contender this year, but you got to pay the piper to play the tune. Halifax and Bathurst, I think whenever next season begins, they'll be about the same, and I think Cape Breton, depending on how they can recoup a little bit from what they paid this year, could be good to be that second best team. Charlottetown is always the wild card. You never really know what you're going to get from Jim Holton, but you're going to get a competitive squad. But I think the team that you have in St. John brings a ton of talent to the table. In particular, to add to that, if Peter Reynolds ends up reporting for the next couple of seasons, that adds another key top line forward to that squad if he does end up coming. Not to mention all the young players that become a year older, a year wiser, a year more talented for the St. John Sea Dogs. There's a significant power vacuum for Trevor Georgie. Out of the 6 first-round picks he has the next 3 years, I'd be surprised if he used half of those. I think he's going to be trading some of those for some immediate help. What that happens to be, I'm not sure, but he's got a question as to does he make a jump and make his team better a little bit more this year to sacrifice the chance at 2022, or does he go all in for 2022? Because, guys, it's no secret St. John's never hosted a Memorial Cup before, and they would love to have a Memorial Cup at TD Station in 2022. Believe me, the team is hungry, and trust me, the fans are definitely hungry in St. John. They saw what Moncton can host. They've seen what other teams in the Q and across the country can host. They want their crack at it, and they're very hungry to get a chance at the Memorial Cup in 2022.
I think there's a lot for St. John still to do, and I don't think there's a clear-cut decision on who the coach is going to be, as they made a decision halfway through the season. And I think the other part of it is all season long, you noticed they, along with Acadie Bathurst, were near the bottom of the standings when it came to defense. And I know they've got some great defensemen back there that like to play offense, in regards to Jeremy Poirier and William Villeneuve, great offensive defensemen that need to learn a little bit more about defense. And do they use some of those picks, as Mike says, to enhance the back end? Of course, you lose Zachary Boutillier, and you have Patino back there, who's shown some streaks of brilliance, but do you then acquire a veteran goaltender and a veteran defenseman to be on the back end of St. John? I don't think St. John have any trouble scoring goals, be it from the defensive end or from the front end. I think they're a very talented bunch, and as Mike said, they'll be a year older. I think the future is bright for them. But yes, whatever they do behind the bench and on the blue line is what sticks out for me.
Well, the other question I have too, in regards to, there's going to be a question mark surrounding the 20-year-olds in St. John. I mean, I don't think it's a secret. They got Anderson McDonald for absolutely nothing. He's playing. Could you see him? I can't see any scenario where he doesn't crack that squad at 20. He's a hometown kid. He wants to play there. He's absolutely dynamic. We've seen him in the league. Obviously, Mike, you were calling the games in Moncton as well with Marty years ago when Moncton acquired him. There was a lot of promising, interesting situation with Anderson moving around, of course. But St. John got to sign him for nothing. So, I mean, you've seen the talent. You've seen what he brings. I mean, what else could we see from a 20-year-old perspective?
Well, I think Anderson McDonald for sure is your top favorite to be a 20-year-old moving forward this season. St. John comes in with 4 chances at some good 20-year-olds. They have him, Matt Gould, Ben Badalamenti, and then Jordan Spatafor. And I think they'll end up keeping Gould as the number 2 on top of the other 2. I think he brings so much to his game as a solid penalty killer. He's a good skater. He grinds his tail off every night. He does an excellent job at being in the uniform and showing up for all 68 games. And that's something you can really call to as a 20-year-old overager. I think he can take a leadership role next season. In terms of that third 20-year-old, Ben Badalamenti fell off a little bit after a really hot first month and a half or so. And Spatafor is the veteran on that defensive end. He had a little bit of trouble taking significant minutes away from the 17-year-old Blue Liners. So in terms of the third 20, I think you might see St. John play the market a little bit and see what's available for a 20-year-old that could be an impact at a bit of a cheaper price.
I absolutely agree. I think they need some guidance back on the blue line. I don't think Spatafor supplies that. I think a profile guy that you can get for, well, as you say, Mike, what are they, 6 first-round picks or 6 high picks? You can't turn that around into a quality 20-year-old defenseman. I think you can, and I think you can, find yourself a solid 19-year-old goaltender that can help on the back end with Patenaude. So that's where I think the development has to be, or the tweaking has to be. I think a 20-year-old defenseman is very important to that team.
Well, guys, we've got about 90 seconds left here, and I want to get your thoughts and opinions quickly, 90 seconds or less. You talk about the coaching situation in St. John. Could we see a change behind the bench?
I think they like the job that Jeff Cowan provided in the second half of the year, and I think there was a significant enough turnaround that I think he's earned the chance at a contract, but it'll depend on who becomes available in the summer.
Chris, you talk about the possibility of hosting a Memorial Cup, and usually have a profile guy behind the bench, and they've had Cowan has an interim attachment to his title. I think they need to find someone, and I think there's somebody that focuses on defense to teach those the Villeneuve and Poirier how to play a little bit better defensively, because that's the only thing that's missing from their game. Villeneuve better defensively than Poirier is, but Poirier's just a riverboat gambler that's just out there going from one end to the other, 200-foot guy, they could call him, as a defenseman. So I think they need some help in that regard, and I think there will be a change.
Well, honestly, guys, I can't thank you guys enough. As I alluded to, joking around with you guys earlier, I mean, I miss talking sports with you guys. I miss seeing you guys around the rink. It's an absolute treat to have you guys on my very first episode here tonight. We've had a lot of fun talking about, the sports, the situation that we're the QMJHL. I really appreciate everybody's thoughts and opinions. Thank you both so much for taking time out to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Chris, anytime.
Anyways, guys, that's going to do it for us here on the first episode of QuaranTV. We really appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
When you become a Rogers volunteer, it's always an opportunity for everybody to come together and try different things that they've never been able to do before.
What I've learned here is different skills that I thought I would never even be interested in learning.
By being here at Rogers, I can learn all these different things that will help me be stronger.
Working here as a volunteer is a good way to get to know your community. It's a good way to learn how to work as a part of a team.
They're people from our community, so they know and they have a heart for our community to step outside of our comfort zone and do more.
Don't be afraid, because this is where you're going to gain the most valuable experience that you can use in your future.
I encourage everybody to be a volunteer at Rogers TV, because not only do you grow professionally, you grow personally as well.
October 5th, 2014, my daughter was hit by a train. She was walking along the sides of the tracks, and it shattered her world.
This is Rogers TV, New Brunswick.
2 dead in Grand Lake massacre.
You okay?
You think they're connected? We are talking about a massacre of innocent people.